Muses of Mythology is a spoiler-heavy podcast.
That's an understatement.
We're going to discuss not just the events of this book, but the Writingverse as a whole, and really anything that we feel is relevant. You can find full spoiler warnings in the show notes. My notes are so messy. Welcome to Muses of Mythology, a podcast where we explore how ancient myths become part of modern pop culture through the lens of Rick Riordan's Magnus Chase and the gods of Asgard. This is Story 79. The thing about Norse mythology is... ... I'm your co-host and podcasting muse, Darien and Smartt. Joining me is my co-host and brother, DJ.
How's everybody doing today? I'm DJ the Muse. I thought today's episode was we were talking about the book.
We already talked about the book.
We already talked about the book?
Yeah, we are. That came out 2 weeks ago.
When did we do that? When did we record that?
3 weeks ago.
Let's muse about it in the garden. You can tell me all about it.
Okay, DJ.
What's up?
As you may recall, and I'm sure our listeners may recall, especially listeners who are listening to this in the future and you're just binging a bunch of episodes back to back, I said last episode that today's topic was going to be on Valhalla.
That is right.
Our first proper jump into exploring Norse mythology, starting with the big way, starting with like the central set location of the Magnus Chase books.
Mm-hmm. However,
I started researching Valhalla and hit a bunch of, not roadblocks, there's a lot of information. The actual research and citing the sources and doing all that stuff it will be as any other episode that we've done in the past.
Yeah.
But the thing I was realizing is that it was coming with a lot of caveats. A lot of things I'd have to explain and define, not just words in regards to these stories and text and like Old Norse words, but like the concept and sources of where we were getting them, and then also why they seem to contradict each other very quickly. So it occurred to me, rather than having to do that in an episode that was already going to be, because Valhalla is a pretty bulky, meaty topic from the jump, rather than trying to do that in that episode. And then also I realized having to do that in every episode going forward, we should just do that all here.
At one time.
We
were explaining why Norse mythology is weird.
Well,
it's told weird.
Why the
sources that we can get.
Study of Norse mythology is different than the study of other Western mythologies.
Exactly where Norse mythology is written.
I think yes. It is complicated. Mm-hmm. And so most I'm doing it here, so we don't have to do it every episode, because that would be annoying for you, dear listener. Or if someone jumps into a random episode and then wants to send us an email about how, well, you didn't consider this and this and this, we can say, oh, but we did. We did a whole episode on it. You just didn't listen to that episode.
Yeah.
Don't talk to me again.
Please.
Here's the main rub. Here's the real gist of it, is that the Scandinavian cultures, wherein we reference this is the Norse, this is the Viking Age, this is where our story's from, they did have a written language. Mm-hmm. They had the runic Scandinavian language. That language was not used for literature. Mm-hmm. They used it for like minor inscriptions. So the reason that's important for this conversation is it means that all of their cultural stories, their religious beliefs, their histories, any form of communication, that was oral. Mm-hmm. It existed as an oral tradition, which is not unique. This is not the only place where the oral tradition was the primary way in which everyday people were engaging with their cultural practices and their religious beliefs. We talk about the bards in Greece and Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how those were probably various different poets telling these stories before they were all brought together into one cohesive, like, cultural identity tradition.
Yeah.
But the difference between Greece and then the talk we have of, like, the Greek mythology and then the Norse mythology is that in Greece, we have the oral traditions. Yes, those were the thing. And that's why when we talk about, well, this is the version of who Persephone was or how Hermes acted or what Zeus represented, like, obviously those things were different there wasn't a unified ancient Greek religion.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, there was not a unified Scandinavian Norse religion.
Okay.
But we did have the ancient Greek people engaging in writing literature. So we have plays, we have fragments of epics and poems. We have histories. And that's important. So we have a written record. But we do have that for the Scandinavian stuff too. We have poems, we have proses, we have sagas. Like, we have those things as well. We have inscriptions. But the difference is that we do not have primary sources for Norse mythology. Do you know what that means?
I assume that means we don't have anything that's like definitive as to like this is exactly what they believed from somebody who also just truly believed it.
Exactly. That's what it is. That is the primary source. So when we have the texts of like the plays and the stuff like and the poems and even like the histories,
these people,
they were the people who lived that culture.
Yeah.
And even if we have like a Roman historian writing down the Greek stories,
Greeks and Romans are almost the same anyway. So
at the very least, what he was writing, okay, again, me apologizing to Ovid again. There you go, Emily. That was their culture. That was what they believed, or at the very least, even if they weren't like believing it religiously, it was their lived culture.
Yeah.
By the time any of these things were being written down in Scandinavia, in Iceland, in Denmark, in Sweden, there was no longer a living tradition of the Norse, what we call pagan worship.
Yeah.
And that's like the core of it. I guess that could have been like the end of it, but they were just, how do I want to say this? What we have in our head, that what we call the quote Viking Age, was really brief in comparison to what we talked about for the last 5 seasons with like Greek and Roman texts and how that, and yes, Greece is not the same as Roman, but those stories had such a long, hefty, like eons.
Mm-hmm.
The Viking Age went from around 790 to 1100 CE.
A good 400 years.
A good 400 years. But
nowhere near Greek and Roman.
Nowhere near. So it's very brief.
Brief in the terms of the history of the world.
The history of the world, not brief as if it was brief a la. In this context, brief does not mean unimportant or not impactful. Brief just means in comparison to when we were running around talking about.
Yeah.
But that timeline still matters.
Yes.
Because while these stories could have originated as early as 790, and we do have evidence of that in some surviving poems and the way they are written in the Norse language, in Old Norse. How do I want to say this? I'm just going to quote Jackson Crawford, who is an Icelandic scholar, professor of Old Norse mythology.
Mm-hmm.
He essentially described it as like, we can, even when we have these texts that were written down well after the fact, they probably date back to like 800 because of the style in which the composition is being told. Because essentially in poetry, you can only change it so much and then it's not poetry anymore.
Yeah.
So that's how you can date these texts, even if the manuscript itself was written down 800 years after the fact. But you still have the fact that it was written down well after the fact. So even if we have the stories that seem like they are probably reliable, and I say reliable in that it's as reliable as anything could be when you have one example of a story that was maybe really important to this one community, but
as
not
reliable as anything can be from almost like over 1,000 years ago.
Yeah. So while the stories that we have were written down around like 1000 or like dated from that, the core myth, according to the National Museum of Denmark, can be traced back to like the 5th century or even longer. And we know this thanks to some artifacts, specifically an item called a gold bracats. I'm so sorry, there's a lot of vowels right next to each other. And this is essentially a medallion, like a medal, an amulet, and it just depicts Norse figures. And we have this object, and we know it dates back to like circa like 400 to 600 CE. So even the era of Viking, where we think about it, the stories they had were older than this seafaring, quote, like Viking just means raider, right? Like that civilization that we think of.
Yeah. Viking was just a profession, not actually what everyone was.
Yeah. And we have to remember that the Norse area, like of Iceland, these stories came there with the Germanic people when they migrated there. And Germanic is a language that is not like the people from Germany, Germanic. Like that's what Germanic means. And they rolled up like as early as 2300 BCE. And they brought those stories with them that were like so much older. I mentioned the Viking Age and how it like went into decline in like 1100. And that's important because the entire Viking Age really coincides with Christianity taking a stronghold in Scandinavia. Iceland famously converted to Scandinavia. Iceland converted to Christianity in the year 1000.
Uh-huh. And
you saw Denmark, Norway, and Sweden establishing their own archdiocese who like report directly to the Pope in 1104, 1154, and 1164, respectively. And I mention that because religion like that doesn't just take hold overnight.
Christian missionaries were fucking going hard.
I mean, yes.
Back in 1000.
Yes. But they had been going hard for several hundred years up to that fact.
Yeah, they've been definitely trying their best to get a foothold.
Mm-hmm. Author Joshua J. Mark said that the Old Norse traditions was the last pagan system to fall to Christianity. It was such a potent force among the people that it was preserved in the works of Christian scribes. Because all of these things we have from Scandinavia, most of it written in Iceland, actually, were written in the 13th century.
Mm-hmm.
So, 200 years after these areas...
It's a good 4 to 5 generations.
Yeah, generations have already been like, oh, we are Christian now.
Yeah.
And while the stories did continue to persist, they were no longer essentially like a story of...
It sounds rough to say this, but they weren't as revered or respected as they once were.
Exactly. I mean, that's literally it, because the stories of the gods, of Odin and Freya and Thor and Loki and of Yggdrasil and the realms, that was how these people understood their world.
Yeah.
That is why things happen. That is why the world, we have mountains and rivers and boulders and valleys, because Odin and his brothers ripped apart their father.
And it's so much simpler to just say God did it.
Kinda. That's the one thing. It's like, and then God just created everything, and you don't have all this complicated, like, well, there was this first, and then this.
You don't gotta remember every story, just some.
Yeah, just kinda. But beyond just this is how our world is created and why it operates, they also would like operate as like communication of cultural value, like how we are expected to behave, because these are our gods in our world, and this is our place in that world.
Mm-hmm.
That context, that reverence, the sacred nature of those stories, by the time they were being written down, were long gone. So where do we even get any of these, the things we're going to be citing? How do we know any of this? If it was just an oral tradition, how do we possibly have what were being carried through? Because it's important to note that like these poems, even with Christianity taken over, like the stories of like Old Norse traditions, Christianity wasn't able to wipe it out. And maybe that's because the church didn't actually have that much like real physical power. Or maybe it was because by the time they took over, they were just seen as like folk tales and didn't have the same like pagan threat that you'd find.
That's probably it, honestly.
Yeah, but they were still around. This wasn't the oral traditions weren't being completely manufactured whole cloth. But I'd ask, like, how do we know?
They're fun bedtime stories.
They kind of, essentially. But I was saying the thing about where they came from, and you were going to answer, and then I went off on the thing. You looked like you had a thought brewing.
Oh, I had a thought brewing because I'm like, the books that your girlfriend got you for your Christmas or birthday. Yeah.
Yeah, you mean the Eddas? The ones I have literally on my bed?
The one I had no idea it even existed until Darren's like, look at what Kelsey got me.
She got me the Eddas for
She
the
got me the
podcast.
Eddas, and I had no idea what that was. I looked at her like, oh, that's great. Amazing.
Okay. So we have the Eddas, and those are essentially the
earliest
only texts we have for these stories. The reason they are still something we know about is because of the Eddas. Edda is an Old Norse word that is just being used by modern scholars to describe these two collections of manuscripts. And they're, again, important to note, these are medieval works, meaning they were being, again, written in the 13th century.
Yeah.
The Middle Ages, we got some Dark Ages going on. Christianity's all the vogue.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the...
Tan, no dyes, very big. No, everyone's wearing tan, black, brown, and white clothes. And the only ones that have dyed are wealthy.
Yeah. No, we're in Iceland, so I genuinely don't know how different it was in Iceland compared to like in Britain or France.
I can't imagine overly different because a lot of Europe was just same for that whole
samesies.
Yeah, it's like there's different architecture, sure, but I imagine that like a lot of culture was very similar up until probably 1500s, maybe 1600s.
Maybe in that region, maybe, especially because the church was this like powerful,
domineering
force, and that were like kind of creating this homogenous. And there were still differences.
I could be
don't
wrong.
know.
I'm just speaking out my ass here. That's just how I feel, and every time I think about Europe during that time, I'm like, it all looks like fucking.
It could just be the media we have, though.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right?
Yeah,
I was about to bring up. It all looks like Witcher or fucking just shit like that.
But it's like, yeah, because I'm like, well, I kind of know what like medieval England looks like, but I don't know what a medieval Iceland looks like. So, but yeah, I actually want to talk about this. I don't know where else to talk about this, and I actually don't even know if this is true. But this is something I read about years ago, and that's the Vikings are somewhat responsible for the Dark Ages.
I wouldn't doubt it.
When the raiders would start like raiding villages and stuff, it became dangerous, and so you just have more isolated communities, and like the interconnected trade and communication just completely collapsed and like plunges Europe in the Dark Ages. That's why you have over in like the Middle East and Asia, no, they didn't have a Dark Ages. We still had all the science and the technology and the stuff. Everything collapses, everyone's scared.
Thanks, Vikings.
Thanks, Vikings. And the Christian church takes over with, we have a religion, but also we want to use this to become powerful, and we're going to use it as a tool that way.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that here because that's the thing I have in my head. I don't know if it's true.
Could be wrong. I'd believe it, though.
But that's the thing. That's like, that just makes a great story, doesn't it? So the Prose Edda, written by a gentleman named Snorri Strurlson.
What a goofy old-ass Icelandic name.
It is in fact a goofy old-ass Icelandic name because this was an old-ass Icelandic gentleman. He was famously, you'll look like, it was written by the Icelandic poet, which, yes, he really, really cared about poetry because he really fucking hated the English and the French style of poetry that were becoming popular. He was not a fan of this shit.
Well, you hate to see it. It's what brought in the money. It's why people built a lot of theaters.
Well, yeah, in certain places, but in Iceland, they did have their own form of poetry. They had like the skaldic poems, which used a lot of alliteration and a lot of allusion to mythic texts. Now, caring so much about poetry is a very like specific thing to have in your life. It's a thing that if you are a farmer with a bunch of kids just trying to survive, you probably don't have. And that's important because Snorri was not a farmer trying to struggle. He was born to a very wealthy Icelandic clan. He became the most powerful chieftain of Iceland for several years.
Such a rich person take to just care about poetry.
Yeah. He afforded the luxury to care about poetry.
Yeah.
Was also, in addition, it's like, but I keep telling you he's a poet and he was wealthy, and that's probably creating a certain idea in your head. This man was also a lawyer and a politician. In his youth, he became what was essentially...
What does it mean to be a lawyer in 1300 CE?
You argued cases against different things. Essentially, people were mad about the law and you dealt with it. He, at one point in time, became what was essentially akin to a knight to the King of Norway, and was much later in time, I'm not even sure if it's the same king, assassinated by a group of people claiming to be agents of the King of Norway. So here's the thing. You go on this man's Wikipedia page, The fact that he authored the Prose Edda is mentioned like one time and it's a long Wikipedia page. He did a lot of stuff.
This dude wrote down the Norse mythology. Yeah, that one. Also.
But also, that was actually not even the most important thing he did.
That wasn't even the most impressive thing he did.
Yeah, he did a lot of stuff. But it's important to us because, well,
that's what we got.
Yes, because we have it now. So, but I mentioned the fact that he really, really cared about poetry and really fucking hated the English and the French poems because he wanted to keep the old Norse, skaldic, whatever, alive, which meant he needed to teach people how to do it. And that's what the Prose Edda is. It is a textbook on how to write these kind of poems. Because
it sounds like a nightmare to read.
Well, it is. Well, actually, it's not because I say textbook, and that sounds a textbook about how to write poetry. Sounds wild. But I mentioned, if you may recall, it's not just the alliterations, the sounds of the poem, but
the reference to mythology.
And in order to write that, you need to know and understand it. And so that's why you have this really important collection of these stories, the Norse stories, because you can't write this style of poetry if you don't know them. Yeah. And so it is full of, it's essentially, it is like he wrote it to be entertaining. He took it all, he put it together in a certain way to tell these stories in a manner that would be engaging. So you, as a poet who wants to learn how to write this, learn it, memorize it, understand it, and it can appreciate it a way that you can then transform it creatively into your work.
And in order to make sure that this book lived on, you had to write one yourself. Every time you learned it, just make sure you make a copy.
So, for example, there's a passage that's called "The Creatures." Oh, and so the translation I've got is translated by Jesse L. Byock.
Right on.
So this is the creatures of the ash tree Yggdrasil. The squirrel called Ratatoskr, Drilltooth.
Or maybe Ratatosk, depending on who you talk to.
Drilltooth runs up and down the ash. He tells slanderous gossip, provoking the eagle and Nidhogg. 4 stages called Dain, Davin, Diur, and Drathor move about the branches of the ash, devouring the tree's foliage. In the Hevergilmir, there are so many serpents with Nidhogg that no tongue can count them. As it says here, and now there's a piece of poetry. The ash Yggdrasil endures hardship more than men know. The stag bites from above, and its sides rot. From below, Nidhogg gnaws. And then there is a citation, the Lay of Grimnir. And so throughout it, it's like he's telling these stories, but then also giving an example of the style of poetry.
Mm-hmm. Neat.
So we've got that. Very important. I'm going to circle back to the
Prose Edda
and the complications of it being, again, not a primary source. But I want to talk about, he's got poems in here. He's like citing these poems. And now you got to wonder, hey, Snorri, where are these poems coming from?
This other Edda that Darren's got.
The other Edda that Darren, exactly. So scholars of the time basically figure, sidebar, Snorri may not have been the one who wrote it. Maybe he just compiled it all. Like, don't worry about it. We'll talk about that. But he's generally considered to be the author of this textbook because he really wanted everyone to know how to write this style of poetry. It was important to him because, pause, circle back, Poetic Edda. So the other one we have is the Poetic Edda. So, as I said, it's full of prose because it's written in prose, these stories with examples of poems. So where are the poems? Where did they come from? And so a lot of scholars kind of figured there must be another text that he is referencing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a little tricky because it's like, yes, maybe, but also, again, remember that they were oral traditions. So it is very likely that he was just writing them based on the oral poems that he knew.
Yeah, he very well. Mm-hmm. I mean, he grew up in Iceland, which was a Scandinavian country.
Yeah, and they have all like that.
And again, 200 years. I feel like at this time, it's a little more common to tell stories of certain things that you've heard from your parent, grandparent, whatever, to the people that you are now raising.
Mm-hmm. So, and I think that the idea that maybe he was pulling from like the oral traditions kind of also underlines the fact that these stories were still there. They weren't wiped out and completely erased by Christianity in the same way like, can you tell me what the Celtics or the Druids were all about For real, for real?
Cuchulainn. That guy's cool as hell.
Is he in Smite?
Yeah, he's in
So, like, yeah.
I mean, there's a couple. There's a him.
I'm not saying
Morgan,
it's all gone, but it's not quite.
Cleodna.
We don't have it in the same way. And maybe we do, and I'm totally wrong. This is just, again, me being like, I don't think so, but that could be wrong. We have it. Listen, Rick Riordan didn't write a Celtic series yet, so here we are.
Yeah, put a pin in it. There's maybe. I feel like I remember feeling something about Celtics revolving around Riordan.
He did write a short story in that anthology.
That's right.
And he did. He's really into it. We can't. That's not what this episode. This episode is about the Eddas.
Yep.
So, 1643. A collect.
The episode title is "The Edda-ting of Norse Mythology."
Oh, DJ, that's so good. Wow, I was just gonna call it the thing about Norse mythology is ... The Edda-ting of Norse mythology is fucking baller. Thanks, man. I love it. So 1643.
Yep.
300
years later.
Yes, exactly. That's important. 300 years. So this was actually 400 years. The Prose Edda was written in the 13th century, so 1200.
Oh, 13th century.
I also do that too with my brain. Sometimes I forget. Wait.
I just remember you said 1300s.
I may have meant 13th century.
Okay. That's right, yeah.
So the Bjornjafur Sevenson.
Bjornjafur Sevenson?
Sure. And he was...
Because I
no, you can't have handed to you. I don't have my notes anymore.
I understand.
So you're reading. He was the Church of Iceland's Bishop of Skjalfnir?
Brynjolfur Sveinsson.
That sounds way better than what I said. Thank you, DJ.
Yep.
So he was a bishop of the church. And all of a sudden, he came into this possession of this old manuscript.
Where the fuck did this come from?
And it was a collection of Old Norse poems. This essentially confirmed, yes, Snorri was referencing older pre-existing poems. He was not writing examples of his own in the Prose Edda to teach. He was citing them from somewhere. And whether or not he could have been citing them from an oral tradition, not whether or not, even if he was citing them from an oral tradition, it still demonstrates he was not creating those poems by himself whole cloth. They existed. They predated his work. And this discovery of this text proved it. Now, this text was then sent to the
printing press.
Actually,
that's not been for another couple of years.
Not yet. And in Germany. No, but it was sent to Denmark, to King Christian IV, which is why this text came to be called the Codex Regius, or the Royal Book.
Nice.
And today, we know it better as the Poetic Edda. Like I said, it's a collection of poems that tell these Old Norse stories. And some of these poems date to 800 AD, so during this Viking Age when these were a living religious tradition. And some of them seem to be a lot more recent, possibly around the same time good old Snorri was writing his how to write a poem textbook. And it's a bunch of different, and it was also like a collection of different manuscripts. So this one, while we know, or we're like, most people are pretty confident that Snorri wrote the Prose Edda. The Poetic Edda is anonymous.
It's a little more up in the air.
A little more up in the air. We don't know who wrote it. And it's also possibly it was written by maybe a bunch of different people, or maybe it's recording just a bunch of different poems.
Or it could be written by the guy who wrote Prose Edda.
Or Snorri!
Yeah, Snorri
maybe
wrote
he
it.
loved it so much, he also wrote it down.
He just wrote down the stories that he was told, you know?
So, the Poetic Edda, it has two parts. And the first part is 10 songs, poems about the gods. And the second part is 19 songs about heroes. And there are things in the Poetic Edda that aren't in the Prose Edda. Because, again, the Prose Edda was written with a very specific purpose to teach these poems and reference these things, was the Poetic Edda appears to be just someone wanted to collect all of these poems. I'm going to cite Crawford again. That was his name, right? Yeah, Jackson Crawford, American scholar, translator, and poet who specializes in Old Norse.
There you go.
He called the Poetic Edda a mixtape put on shuffle. It's not, so you said like, oh, the Prose Edda sounds terrible to read. Well, the thing about it is like the Poetic Edda might be more difficult to read.
It's just not in order. There's no order to this.
It's not that kind of, it's not supposed to be read in front to back in order. He also called it essentially a greatest hits list. So it's not a fully comprehensive understanding record of the beliefs of like ancient
Yeah.
Well, ancient pre-Christian Scandinavia.
Yeah.
It's a bunch of stories that were perhaps really popular. Maybe they were really culturally important. Maybe someone just really liked them. It's not, we don't know we can, by comparing it to the Prose Edda, by comparing it to like archaeological finds we have, we can pretty much guess the cultural importance of a lot of these and measure them. But you can't say with 100% certainty how the people who lived this when it was a living tradition felt about these in terms of like how, citing Christianity as an example, how someone maybe feels about the story of Jesus Christ, Adam and Eve, Noah versus the story of Job.
I can vaguely remember Job.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure if we ask Dad, he'll know Job.
Oh, Job! Dad absolutely knows Job. And this is not me saying that Job is a less important or less impactful religious text than the others, but just casually, if you're gonna say which do you think is like which is your favorite, which is more important, which has more impact, I'm probably gonna talk about like Noah more than you're gonna talk about Job.
Fucking yeah, Adam and Eve, all these stories from.
So that's something I also wanted to note is that it's hard to say when it was a living tradition, which of these stories had the everyday impact and which were just, my dad's really familiar with this text type deal. And these are not the only sources we have for these stories. We also have the sagas I mentioned earlier, which are like a collection of Icelandic stories that are also very likely, almost certainly, based off of oral traditions as well. And they will be about gods, and they will be about like family heritage, genealogy, histories, things like that. But they were also not written down until the 13th century. Yeah. So again, some of them maybe could be considered like primary source for like Iceland, and they do line up with some histories, but they aren't not a primary source in that they were written by the people who were experiencing them in real time. Because most of the Icelandic sagas take place are set during 930 and 1030, but they were written almost 300 years after the fact. Meanwhile, we also have these skaldic poems, but these ones are rarely about the myths themselves. Mm-hmm. They have allusion to the myth, which means the Prose Edda or the Poetic Edda is not skaldic. I don't think. No, that's just a style of poetry, and those are also done by like performing oral poets in Iceland. So they're great, but they're no more a primary source than the Eddas. Other places that we do have this idea of when we're trying to understand what life was like. We have Adam of Brennen, who was a German writer. And in like 1070-ish, he wrote a book about pagan rituals in Sweden, which is considered really valuable as like an account of what pagan life was like in pre-Christian Scandinavia. Yeah. But simultaneously, at this point in time, Iceland had already converted to Christianity. So like, while he was probably talking to people who did still practice, because Sweden wouldn't have their archdiocese until like 100 years later. Yeah. But you can't say
it was already like a decent chunk of maybe not a majority of the population, but a plurality of the population that was already believing in Christianity.
It was not really when he was writing it. And maybe he was hearing stories, and maybe he was taking texts from other people and like compiling things. And that's all well and good. And again, this is an important text. This is something that like scholars and historians look to like understand this time period better. Mm-hmm. But it was not written literally before Christianity had come to influence the area. Now, a shout out to Rome.
Classic Rome.
Classic. Yeah, literally. Tacitus, who was a Roman writer. He lived between 54 and 102. The year 54 and 102.
Classic Rome.
And so he wrote a text called...
This dude knew the guy who killed Jesus. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. But he did write a text we call Germania, which was about the religious practices of the Germanic people. Uh-huh. And as we talked about earlier, the Germanic people are the ones who would migrate to the area of Scandinavia and become or bring with them the religious practices that would become what we call Norse mythology. Now remember that text was written between the year 54 and 120. And the Norse stories that we are talking about
is about 1,000 years later.
Took place in like 700 to year 1100. So like you can't really.
There's a good evolution of culture. It's a little slower than recent years, but it's still.
Yeah, it'd kind of be like jumping over and checking out religious practices of the Church of England in like 1200 or whatever, and then saying, and that's what they practice in America in 2018. And you're like,
no, not quite.
But you could reasonably draw some comparisons, or really see the proto.
Yeah,
and that's also something that is used. And these are the written texts we have, but they're not the only thing we have to piece together the stories, this world.
I imagine that there's got to be some traveling scholars that eventually bumped into Scandinavians who didn't kill them immediately. You know?
Probably, but maybe they didn't write it down. Or the good thing about it is that paper doesn't last. Papyrus doesn't last. Like things like this, they don't last. Like maybe someone did, and maybe they did travel out there and they did write it all down exactly the way it was told to them, with the same reverence
but
that
was being
told.
Or
but it's
burned
or lost or molded.
Library.
Yeah, just gone.
Yeah.
But you know what? Things do survive from that era in archaeological evidence. They didn't write a lot, but they carved a lot. We have the Gotland picture stone, which depicts scenes that we know as Norse mythology. For example, Odin on the back of his horse. The
runes were a lot easier to carve into things.
Yeah, and rune stones, which mention gods, and then there are also illustrations of myths.
Yeah.
Amulets that are shaped like important items, like Thor's hammer. Tons of those. We have tons of these little Mjolnir amulets, which also tell us like Thor was super important. Different idols, literally little tiny idols that you'd fit in your pocket, and then also the names of places, what people called them, can demonstrate when they're named after gods and things like that. Will demonstrate that when this was a living practice, how these people felt about it, how they engaged with it. So it's not totally lost. It's not completely gone, because we do have a handful of primary sources that demonstrate and show that we can draw conclusions about.
Yeah.
But again, we don't have a store. We don't have a Rosetta Stone. We don't have like underneath this illustration of Odin on his horse, a text carved in the runic language telling a story.
This is when Odin did this.
Yes. But if you know
Odin hanging from Yggdrasil, and it's just a depiction of Odin with a spear in his side and missing an eyeball.
Basically, yeah, we don't have all of those things. So we have the Eddas. And now here's the thing about the Edda. I'd like to read to you, briefly, the prologue of the Edda.
Okay.
Not the whole thing. It's a little long. But let me read you the first few lines of literally the first thing. You get the Edda, and you're going to sit down and read the Edda, which is again a textbook on how to write.
This is what Snovi wanted you to know.
Yeah. Snorri. In the beginning, Almighty God created heaven and earth and all that pertains to them. Lastly, he created two people, Adam and Eve, and from them came clans, whose descendants multiplied and spread across the world. But as time passed, some people became dissimilar from one another. Some were good and held to the right beliefs, but a large majority turned to the desires of the world and neglected God's commandments. For this reason, God drowned the world and all its living things in a flood, except for those who were on the ark with Noah.
Yep.
After Noah's flood, 8 people remained alive, and they inhabited the world, and from them descended the families of man. And that goes on and on and on.
What a speedrun of the Bible.
I mean, I think all that does happen in Genesis, which is just the first book of the Bible.
Yeah. God did not like Sodom, so he flooded the world.
He flooded the whole, well, I was going to say goddamn world, but that seems a little sacrilegious in this context.
Like, he did. He did
damn the world. So that's interesting. I think that's worth considering when we call the Prose Edda our most important source for Norse mythology. And we remember mythology is a religious practice that is no longer a living tradition in that context. That the first thing is the speed run of the book of Genesis.
Gotta get through it.
And that's...
So keep in mind, what I'm about to explain to you is didn't happen, but this did.
That's exactly right, DJ. That's exactly it. That is why that scholars think it is here at all, is specifically so Snorri didn't have to
compete with the church properly.
Didn't have to worry about the church feeling threatened by what he wrote, but also, like, he was Christian. So also there's a chance that he wanted to remind, like, I'm about to share these stories, and I'm going to tell you, these stories be ass. Like,
these stories are great. These are dope.
Excited about this.
Thor, he's cool.
And he ate them every day. But he's like, but I want you to remember what happens when people don't worship God like they're supposed to. He'll flood the earth. So let's not do that. We're in Iceland. It's an island.
Remember what happens when people create false idols.
Doesn't like
plagues.
No,
we don't like those.
So just want to remind you that essentially the idea was like, listen, these are just stories. No respectable person would believe or worship them the same way we do these stories of God and Adam and Eve and Noah. So that's when we talk about it not being a primary source written by someone who lived it. That's there. But also simultaneously, that doesn't mean that the poetic Edda, or the prose Edda and Snorri
disrespected it.
They disrespected it, or is something that we can't call Norse mythology.
No, I mean shit. We call a lot of things written by Ovid Greek mythology.
Kinda, yeah. Except I would say Ovid did believe them in the same way that.
But Ovid was Roman.
But he was Roman. But as I mentioning earlier, like he was in that living practice, whereas Snorri is not. A couple other things to cite is that Snorri will then, in the prologue, go on to. Let me read this to you. I'm just going to read you the title of this section, and you could tell me. The people of Troy and Thor. And this section essentially claims that the gods of Asgard were actually of Troy.
That's great.
And they left Troy. And
dude, Troy spawned several mythologies apparently.
Well, that's obviously not something that the people of Scandinavia of the Old Norse would have been saying. That's not a thing.
Like we didn't know anything about Troy. What?
That's not a story they had. But at this time,
it's also fucking 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, like that's wild. And there could be like twofold because he cites, he edits the genealogy to say that like Hector of Troy was in fact Thor, and that the great stories of Ulysses could be attributed
Thor
to the
got bested by Achilles.
Well, that's the thing. Maybe he didn't. Maybe they all just ran away. That maybe Ulysses was Loki, and maybe he said these things for twofold. Like maybe it was to. The stories of Troy and stuff were popular. They were known in Scandinavia. There was a saga about it. And then so maybe he was trying to like appease the king at the time to get his text more widely accepted.
I wouldn't doubt it.
Simultaneously, he could have been like, well, we have writing now because that's something the church did bring. The writing literature, using it in like literature, recording things, recording everything, being able to share it with everybody. We have that now. And he's like, well, and now we are part of like Europe. And so Snorri could have also been like, I want to tie the cultural practices of antiquity of my region with the grand heroes of Europe, essentially. And so he's like, well, the great city of Troy, those guys were our gods. Once upon a time, but they weren't gods, they were just people. Don't worry about that. And so it could have been like that too, him like making
they stumbled upon the portal to Asgard and then became gods.
Exactly, just like that. Just a like a creative decision to make this to connect the cultural stories because again, and I know I've said it before, but I really want to underline the fact that even with Christianity completely taking hold, everyone here is Christian. They have like this is for hundreds of years. We still had these poems. We still had these stories in this region, which underline they were still important, even though they were considered pagan and they were not they're not religious, but they are our cultural storytelling traditions. They were valuable. And Snorri wanting to connect that with the like grand sweeping epic of like Troy and the Iliad, that says a lot about how he wanted these stories to be as elevated in importance as Troy was. But also that just also continues to underline that this was someone who, in recording these stories, had a very specific agenda. Now, sometimes I think agenda is like a dirty word, but I'm not trying to say it is here. He had a purpose. He had a goal.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to talk about is how Snorri would make some claims about how these Norse stories, this idea, this mythology, how it like operated fundamentally. Specifically, he claimed that everyone who goes to battle would go to Odin's hall at Valhalla.
Yep.
And everyone else who died in any other manner went to hell. But that, right off the bat, with other like poems in the Poetic Edda,
is
true. Not what we know was not the standard belief, because
even in Rick's books, it's not true.
Yeah, we had Freya and her hall, and then we had
not Alfheim. Alfheim?
Folkvogner?
Volkvogner.
Yeah, that's what it's called. Like her hall is the Valhalla.
I just don't remember what that realm is called.
We'll do an episode about it.
There you go.
And then how like those who drowned, which would be a pretty big deal to a seafaring race of Vikings, would end up with the giantess Ran, right? Like there were many different afterlives that the dead could enter based on many, many different criteria. And so we do see Snorri making editorial decision in this thing. And maybe he just wanted to simplify it. Maybe he wasn't familiar with the stories. Maybe it was to make a more like comfortable comparison with heaven and hell and Christianity. Because that's another thing. He was Christian and he was like a wealthy family, had political power. You don't have those things in medieval Scandinavia if you
worry
are Christian.
About going to war.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about war. But you also like don't get that kind of power if your family was not Christian.
Yeah.
Was not following the church.
If you didn't believe
rules.
in the church, you were weird.
Yeah, you weren't. They were not gonna let that slide. You have power in this area and you're not following all rules.
Yeah,
we don't think so. So you can't say that his own like religious understanding did not influence the manner in which he organized these stories. Because also he was sharing it with people who shared that same identity and belief and lens.
Yeah.
So he was portraying and collecting and recording these stories in a manner in which they would be best digestible to the people. Because again, his goal was to get people to write in this poetic style. That is that was what it is for. It's a poem handbook, essentially.
Yeah.
And just wild. In regards to like Snorri and stuff. So according to Anthony Falks, who did do a translation of the Edda, he talks about how there's no reason to believe, however, that everything in the Gylfaginning is derived from ancient tradition, whether oral or written. Snorri was a Christian and only had a scholar's and an artist's interest in mythology. He was preserving for antiquarian, not religious reasons. He would not have felt it wrong to depart from or expand his sources in Gylfaginning. I'm not saying that right, I'm sorry. 2, if artistic or other considerations were required. He probably would not have felt inhibited from inventing new stories or drastically altering the ones he saw fit. Continues on to say, moreover, it is unlikely that Snorri gives a very accurate picture of Norse mythology as a whole. Both Vospa and Gylfaginning.
Gotta love Scandinavian words.
Treat heathen mythology.
They're fun to say, but hard to read if you don't know how to say them.
They're fun to look at in a systematic way, which was surely alien from the nature of the heathen religion itself, which must have been considered a rather disorganized body of conflicting traditions that was probably never reduced in heathen times to a consistent orthodoxy such as Snorri attempts to present. His account of it is colored by his Christian education, which would have taught him to expect a religion to be a system of coherent beliefs.
Nice. Let me see some of these words.
Yeah. So essentially what Falcon puts so eloquently there is that in addition to like
Gylfaginning?
Yeah.
Those are some letters that I don't even know.
Yeah, right?
I don't know what the little
we don't use that letter.
Up below the O.
That's not a letter we use.
It's not a letter in the English lexicon. I'll have to Google it later.
But so essentially, it's not just he was like putting it together, because he was also, even was to say like he was out the gate saying like, hey, these are not figures you should worship. That's not what it's about. He was still acutely aware that this was a religion by these ancient the people. And so in recording and presenting the texts, he is essentially, like Falcon says, like he's coming at it with certain expectations of what a religion is supposed to be and the belief systems and the structure that they're meant to have. The idea that like in Christianity, if you are good and you follow the rules, you get rewarded. And if you behave poorly, you will be punished. And that's just not a thing in these stories. That was not a concept that well, maybe it was, but based on the evidence we have, that idea of like just desserts in the afterlife wasn't a concept that the Norse folks of this time actually had, and therefore it was not reflected in their ideas of what the afterlife would be.
My phone doesn't have that O. It's rough. It's got like every other O.
But not that O.
Not that one. It's got O with the fucking cross. Mm-hmm. Whatever, it's fine. It's got the U with the little curly Q on it, but it doesn't got the O with a little curly on it.
Mm-hmm.
Sucks.
Yeah. So with all that information, if I were to say, this is Valhalla, and I cite a passage from the Prose Edda, is it reliable?
As best as it can be.
As best as it can be. That is the answer we were looking for.
Yeah.
What we have as best as it possibly is. And I think it's put most succinctly by Rafael de Almeida Semido and Isabella Fernandez in their paper, The Context of Christianity and the Process of Composition of the Prose Edda. The work portrays a view of pagan past through Christian lens. As simple as it can be.
Yeah.
It is not just a work being interpreted through another culture, but it is also a work being interpreted
specifically through
a lens of the past, a culture that doesn't exist anymore, that even if the author wanted to make it, even if his goal wasn't to give you a textbook on how to write poetry in a certain way, if he was actually wanting to record these as they were valued as a religious belief, he simply could not have been able to do so.
No,
because
sadly.
It was several hundred years out of the time in which it was a living tradition.
Yeah.
So, but I say all this not to say that, like, I'm not trying to vilify Snorri or the authors of the Eddas or the sagas or the poets or...
They did God's work.
Basically, kind of, yeah. Yeah, they did, and Snorri's work in particular really became, like, the foundation of, like, national identity for different, like, Scandinavian, like, cultures at certain times. It is not to say just because it is not a primary source that would most accurately give us a glimpse of what the people of these Norse cultures who had these stories in their, that created and lived with and evolved these stories for their times would have felt. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's so important. Because, like I said, like, Snorri was citing the poems that we only found when the Edda, Poetic Edda, that Codex Regius book appeared in 1643, 400 years after the Prose Edda. And you gotta wonder, in 1643, if a bishop finds a book full of pagan poems, does he keep them if he didn't already familiar with those stories from a respected, like, Icelandic literary? That these works were already known and embraced as not pagan doctrine, but as a text for writing art.
The 16th century, it really could have been a toss-up.
It could have been a toss-up. So, and I don't know enough about it to say this.
It was probably 60-40. They burn it.
Kind of. They find it, and he gives it to the king of Denmark.
And the king recognized, like, this shit's important.
Yeah, like, oh, this is what Snorri was citing.
I've read Snorri's work.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we know these stories, and, like, does it get saved if you didn't already have the Prose Edda in existence?
It was a bishop of Sweden that found it, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It was super lucky that it was a bishop from one of the Scandinavian countries who the only reason I imagine that it was kept is that they knew about it is because he was Swedish.
Yeah, it was like written in, it's wild. The thing about it is, like, it was written in, like, the 13th century, I'm pretty sure, when this manuscripts were compiled, and then just no one knew about it. It's just gone. And then all of a sudden we find all these poems.
Snorri had it at some point.
So maybe he did. Maybe he was citing different versions. Maybe he was oral. Like, again, we don't know. But that's kind of really important. So that, like, it's not so...
It gives you the feeling that there might be another one out there.
It could be. Or someone else found it and burned it. And we never heard about it. Like some other... Or, like, in Iceland, it turned up in Germany. It turned up in France, which would be wild. I don't know how this Icelandic collection of manuscripts showed up in Sweden. It's not that far away, but still, it is. The existence of the Poetic Edda and the Codex Regius demonstrates that Snorri and his Prose Edda were not the only written resource, just like the sagas and stuff. But you do have to wonder if Snorri didn't, like, get it as a respectable thing, as an artistic thing.
If he didn't normalize Norse mythology.
Yeah. for long enough. And maybe it would have been fine. Again, like the story still existed when everyone was a Christian. So maybe the guy would have found it and been like, tight.
These are sick, dude.
Yeah, but maybe not. And also, without both of them, without the prose Edda, which was written in prose, so it was these stories were very easily accessible in a way that the poetic Eddas just aren't.
Yeah.
Because they're written in a style of poetry that was falling out of fashion. Then maybe we don't have them. And we are amateurs. We are so baseline. We hang out here, we talk, we present what we find, what we think, what we're interested in. Like, that's what we do here. This is no by any means meant to be. If you're writing a paper, do not cite this as a source. You could be like, that was interesting, and you can follow up with actual research, and maybe we were totally wrong. I only have so many. Listen,
Darren only has so many hours in the day.
and so many resources I can have access to in the position I'm at. Like, I don't get to.
Darren's not part of college anymore. She doesn't get that library.
The paper, the academic paper I referenced, the context of Christianity and the process of composition of the prose Edda, that's the one I get. Because otherwise, it was the one free download I got from that website to look at. And there were a bunch of other papers that I really would have liked to read to reference for this podcast.
It sounds like you need to become just like a one class Andy.
just to have
be able to access the library.
Yes, I'm going to pay them $300 a semester.
No. You go to like some CWI with a nice $150. $300 a year. Come on.
Listen. Patreon tier. We hit a certain point. Darien re-enrolls in college just to have a student email again to have access to all this stuff. Unfortunately, I don't. I did at the start of the podcast, and tragically did not know how to utilize it appropriately for research. And now, here we are, 4 years later.
But fortunately, Darren graduated.
I graduated, so yay! And now I'm writing a book. Whatever. So that's a thing. And so, as I said, like, we could have been totally wrong. There are probably maybe there might be a listener who knows maybe more than us, which is wild. If you know so much more than me, why are you listening to this show? There's got to be better.
No, they like us.
Oh, they just like us. Well, you can just like it. That's nice too. Hopefully, if you like us, you also understand where we're coming from. You're not going to get mad. If you do know more, like for real, know more about this topic, about the references, about things,
to hear from you.
We would love to hear from you. Like for real. Like let us. If you have access to an academic paper that is about this thing that can give us more context as we go forward with these stories, and
send Darren a physical copy to our address.
No, you can send me a PDF to our email, musesofmythology@gmail.com. Please. I would love to have more things to pull from reliably because this is a cool topic. But that's the gist. That's the editing of
That's
Norse
the editing of Norse mythology.
Oh, yeah. And even though the poetic Eddas, that they were also written it later on. They also might not even accurately. Like, they're more
It's the best we got.
than Snorri, but it's the best we got. So when we talk about this is what Odin did, this is what Thor did, this is what Loki did. Every one of those statements comes with caveat. It did in the context of what we can say Norse mythology is today, not necessarily or even close to what it was when it was a living practice.
God, it would be so crazy if like we somehow am able to like just like divinely see what it was, and it's exactly what these Eddas are.
Incredible. What a twist. Oh, the odds. The odds are so small. And yet, Snorri, we all owe Snorri an apology. He had it nailed down. Even though he mentioned Valhalla and then didn't mention any of the other places the dead go. Okay.
Oh, I was talking about in the poetic Edda. Like the poetic Edda was like actually.
Actually, yeah, it's the poetic. Thank you all so much for listening. I know this is definitely a very different kind of episode.
Yeah. We just didn't want to explain ourselves every single time.
Yeah. And this felt...
Darren didn't want to explain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this also felt like I knew conceptually it's not accurate because Christian scribes wrote it down. But I wanted to know more. And even still, to say it's not accurate because Christian monks wrote it down is not even an accurate statement to make.
It's a little reductionist to say it like that.
Yeah. But I think that's even those folks who do know that, like you said at the top, Norse mythology is weird for some reason. Listen, I was researching this for hours just for this. So
we almost didn't actually record it today because Darren was researching
it was just,
for hours.
It's one of those things that it's like, you know it, but to dedicate the time to figure out exactly, but why is it? Do you know how many times I had to Google the difference between the Poetic, the Eddas, and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and who wrote Norse mythology and dig and dig and dig and dig? I did it, so you don't have to. So, dear listener, if this was interesting for you and you're like, I want to use this as a springboard to learn more, hell yeah, tell us more. If you use this as if this inspires you to write more about it, to learn more about it, and you learned something cool that we didn't talk about or that we were totally wrong about, and you got a great source that's like, nah, this is what's up. Again, musesmythology@gmail.com. I would love for you to tell me, hey, here's a cool source that talks about this more in depth in a way that you didn't have access to at the time. Yeah, I don't like people telling me, well, actually, if you actually read a single myth about da-da-da, like, no. That's not what that's you. But I don't have to tell you, dear listeners. You know for a fact we read these myths.
Yeah.
That's people on Instagram who want to leave shitty comments on my videos about Hera. What's your problem? Obviously, I know the myth. I knew it well enough to create a recontextual explanation of Hera using fucking has-been hotel dialogue. Yeah, I read the myths. You don't create that level of unhinged nonsense if you don't have a strong grasp of the core topic.
Or if your grasp is just crazily loose.
Sometimes it could go either way, but I think
there is no in between. You don't have a basic understanding of something and then try to make something that unhinged. No, it's either you don't know it or you know it.
Yeah. And I often think that, and if you don't know it, you don't care about it enough to make it.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to really know it and really care about it. Hey, if you're not following us on Instagram, you should. Because I work really hard on these videos that we post every day. And they're, I think, fun and silly. Come follow us there.
Go follow us on patreon.com/Muses of Mythology. We do a lot of fun stuff over there. I'd love to hear from you guys. I lead the bonus episodes for the most part.
Yeah, DJ's in charge of those. We did actually, let's talk about the Patreon. We did a really kick-ass bonus episode about planning Annabeth's trip to Disney World.
Yeah.
That throwaway line from the end of the last episode of the show. We invited our friends from Standby Line, the theme park podcast, to come on. And my girlfriend was there too.
Yeah. And next week, we're talking about Has-Been Hotel.
Yeah. Speaking of it, that wasn't just a random thing I said. It was foreshadowing. Thank you all so much for joining us, for listening. Again, our inbox is totally open. musesmythology@gmail.com. If you've got more cool references and resources and things that we can use to understand this better and you are willing and can share them, I'd love to hear it from it. I'd love to have more. And I promise that we will be back in your ears on Tuesday, March 5th to talk about Valhalla. I promise this time it'll be Valhalla.
This time for sure.
For sure. What else could possibly come up?
I don't know. Let's hope.
And until then, don't be like Zeus.
Don't be like Zeus.
Muses of Mythology is created and hosted by Darien and DJ Smartt. It's edited by Darien Smartt. The show is produced by Darien and DJ Smartt, as well as
Tim O'Connor, The Crystal Conman, Nicholas Miller. Our music is Athens Festival by Martin Hain, and our cover art is by Audrey Miller. You can find her on Instagram at bombshellnutshellart.
Want more Muses of Mythology? Support the show on Patreon. Just $1 gets you exclusive bonus content. Get more at patreon.com/Muses of Mythology.
You can also support the show by leaving a review at lovethepodcast.com/Muses of Mythology. Or tell a friend why you love the show.
Don't forget to check out all of our episodes and episode transcripts at musesofmythology.com.
Thanks for listening.